My name is Lucienne Tremblay. I am 88 years old, and I delivered 3 generations of a hidden lineage in a Quebec lumber settlement called Rivière-aux-Cèdres between the spring of 1963 and the autumn of 2004. And the men of that camp protected the secret of those births for 62 years without ever putting a single word of it into writing. I am telling this story now because the last lumberjack from the original crew, a man named Roland Boudreau, died in his sleep on the 2nd of February of this year. With him went the last living witness besides me, and I do not have many seasons left in this body, and the third generation child whose birth I attended in 2004 is now 21 years old and has asked me, in her own quiet way, whether her grandmother's story will be remembered or whether it will go into the ground with the people who carried it. I sat with that question for a long time. Then I picked up the telephone and called my niece's son, who had bought me a small recording device for my last birthday because he worried about my memory. And I told him I had something to say into it, and I asked him to leave me alone in the kitchen while I said it. This is what I told the recorder. Rivière-aux-Cèdres was a logging settlement on the north arm of the Péribonka watershed, about 140 kilometers above Lac Saint-Jean, in the boreal forest where the black spruce begins to thin and the white birch holds the high ground. There is no town there now. The buildings were hauled out or burned in 1978 when the company shut the operation down, and the road has gone back to alder and willow, and unless you know exactly where to leave the highway, you would drive past the turn and never know the place existed. But in 1963, there were 54 men and 7 women living in that camp, and we had a kitchen building, a bunkhouse, an office, a stable for the draft horses, a smithy, a chapel, and 7 small log houses where the foremen and their wives lived. I lived in the smallest of those houses because I was the only midwife within 2 days' travel of the camp, and the company paid my husband Emile a bonus to keep me on hand. Emile was a sawyer. He was a tall, thin, quiet man who had grown up in Saint-Félicien and chose to live his life with a saw in his hands because he loved trees more than he loved towns. We had been married 11 years, and we did not have children of our own, which was a sorrow I had stopped speaking about by then. I had been delivering babies since I was 21. My mother had been a sage femme in the parish of St. Hedwige before me, and her mother before her. By 1963, I had delivered 91 babies and lost 2 mothers and 4 infants, which is a number I can still recite the way some women recite the rosary. The thing I am about to tell you began on the 7th of April, 1963. Marie-Ange Lavoie was 19 years old. She had married a French-Canadian lumberjack named Jean-Paul Lavoie in the autumn of 1961 and had come up to Rivière-aux-Cèdres with him in the spring of 62 because the company offered the married men a small house and a winter wage that was better than anything Jean-Paul could find in the towns. She was small, 5 feet and 1 inch, 98 pounds when she was not pregnant, with dark hair she wore in a braid and gray eyes that always looked a little startled. She was sweet and quiet, and she missed her mother, and the other wives in the camp had taken her in the way women in isolated places take in young brides. Jean-Paul Lavoie was killed on the 18th of October, 1962. A black spruce he had felled hung up in another tree on the way down, and when he went to the base to cut the binding limb, the upper trunk released and dropped 50 feet onto his shoulders. He was dead before any of the crew reached him. Roland Boudreau, who was 26 at the time and the head of Jean-Paul's chopping team, carried him out on his own back through 3 kilometers of logging cut. Roland told me decades later that the worst thing he ever did in his life was knock on the door of that little log house and tell Marie-Ange Lavoie, 19 years old and 7 weeks pregnant and not yet sure of it, that the boy who had brought her up to this place was not coming home. She did not scream. She did not weep where Roland could see her. She sat down on a kitchen chair and she said, "I'll need to go back to my mother now." But she did not go back to her mother. The truck that was supposed to take her down to Roberval did not come for 3 days because there was an early storm and the road was closed, and during those 3 days Marie-Ange did not eat, and on the fourth day she walked out of her house at 4 in the morning in a wool coat over her nightdress, and she walked into the forest north of the settlement, and she did not come back until 41 days later. I do not know what happened in those 41 days. No one knows. Marie-Ange would not speak of it for the first several months, and when she finally did speak of it, she spoke only to me, and only in fragments, and only with a kind of hush in her voice that made me understand she was telling me what she could carry, telling and nothing more. She came back on the 28th of November, 1962. Roland Boudreau was the one who saw her. He was hauling a load of slash to the burn pile when he looked up and saw a small, dark figure standing at the edge of the cutting, perfectly still, watching him. He thought at first it was a yearling moose. Then he looked again, and it was Marie-Ange, in the same wool coat, the hem of her nightdress in tatters around her ankles, her hair loose down her back, her face the color of paper, and she was alive and standing on her own 2 feet, and she was 12 weeks pregnant with a child whose father was already in the ground. That is what we believed at the time. That is what she let us believe. Roland walked her into the kitchen building, and the cook, a Saguenéen woman named Alma Gagnon, who had a temper and a heart that were both larger than the room she stood in, sat Marie-Ange down by the cook stove and put a blanket over her shoulders and a cup of broth in her hands and asked no questions. Alma had buried 2 husbands and 3 children of her own, and understood that some kinds of returning needed silence more than they needed answers. The next morning she sent Roland to fetch me. I walked into that little back room and I saw a girl who was very thin and very pale and very clean. She had washed somewhere. Her hair was wet and combed and braided neatly down her back. Her nightdress had been replaced by one of Alma's old house dresses, which hung on her like a sail. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were enormous in her face. And when I sat down on the edge of the bed, she looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then she said, in a voice so soft I had to lean forward, "Madame Tremblay, I am going to need your help, and I am going to need you not to ask me any questions." I told her I would help her. I told her I would not ask any questions. I have kept both of those promises for the rest of her life and most of mine. I examined her. She was 12 weeks pregnant by my measurement, which matched the date of Jean-Paul's death and the dates I knew of their marriage. And the pregnancy looked, to my hands, entirely ordinary. The baby's heartbeat, when I found it with the wooden trumpet I carried in those years, was strong and regular. Marie-Ange was malnourished, but not dangerously so. She had no injuries that I could see. Her feet, which I had expected to be a ruin, were calloused but whole. Whatever had happened to her in those 41 days, she had been kept warm enough, fed enough, and unharmed enough to walk out of the forest on her own. I asked her one question, even though I had promised I would not. I asked her if she wanted to go home to her mother in Roberval. She closed her eyes and said no. She said her mother would not understand. She said no one in the world would understand except possibly me, and the best thing I could do for her was let her stay in this camp and help her have her baby in this camp and keep my mouth shut about everything I was about to learn. I told her she could stay. I told her I would speak to the foreman and to my husband, and we would arrange for her to keep the little log house Jean-Paul had been allotted, with a wood ration and the small widow's stipend the company paid out of a fund kept for such purposes. I told her I would visit her every week, and that when her time came she would deliver in her own bed with me in the room and no one else. She nodded. She closed her eyes. She slept for 14 hours. The pregnancy carried through the winter without incident. Marie-Ange grew slowly and then, in the 3rd trimester, very fast. By March of 1963, she was the size of a woman carrying twins. And I told her so. And I told her I wanted to bring her down to the hospital in Roberval for the delivery because a small woman carrying a large baby is the kind of risk a country sage femme does not take lightly. She refused. She refused so completely and so calmly that I understood arguing would be cruel. She said she would deliver in her own house with me, and if she died, she died, and the baby would die too, and that would be God's will, but she would not get into a truck and ride to a hospital where strangers would put their hands on her child. I told my husband Emile that night. Emile listened the way he always listened, with his hands folded and his eyes on the lamp. And when I had finished, he said only one thing. He said, "Lucienne, that girl has had one terrible thing happen to her already. Do what she asks. Whatever happens, I will be in the next room." I tell you this because I want you to understand that the men of Rivière-aux-Cèdres were not stupid men, and they were not credulous men. They were Saguenéens and Beaucerons, and a few Acadians who had drifted west. Catholic, as most rural Quebecois of that generation were Catholic. They worked with chainsaws and crosscut saws and skidding horses, and they slept and got up before light and did it again. They were not the men you would expect to keep a secret of the kind I am about to tell you, but they kept it. Marie-Ange went into labor on the 7th of April, 1963, at about 3 in the afternoon. I was in her kitchen by 4. Emile was in the front room with a kettle on the stove and a stack of clean towels and a pile of newspaper in case I needed to put down protection on the bed. The labor was hard from the start. The baby was huge. I could feel that with my hands on her belly, and I could see it in the way Marie-Ange's small frame had stretched to accommodate something that should not have fit inside her at all. The labor went on through the night. By midnight, she had been working for 9 hours, and by 3 in the morning for 12, and the baby was crowning, but it was not coming, and Marie-Ange was beginning to gray at the lips, and I knew, with the certainty that comes from delivering 91 other babies, that I was about to lose her. I went to the front room. Emile looked up. I told him to go to the bunkhouse and bring back Alma Gagnon and Roland Boudreau, and to do it fast and to not say a word to anyone else. Alma came at a run in her house dress and a coat she had not bothered to button. Roland came behind her, still in his work pants, his hair flat from sleep. I put Alma at Marie-Ange's head, holding her hand in her shoulders. I put Roland at the foot of the bed, kneeling, and I told him I needed him to push gently and steadily on the upper part of Marie-Ange's belly when I told him to, because the baby was too large for her to push it out by herself. Roland did exactly what I told him. He had hands like wagon wheels, and he used them with the delicacy of a man holding a wren. He pressed when I said press and stopped when I said stop, and at 4:11 in the morning on the 8th of April, 1963, the baby came out into my hands, and Marie-Ange let out a long sigh that sounded like the sound a tire makes when it goes flat, and the world I had been living in until that moment turned very slowly on a hinge I had not known was there. The baby was a girl. She weighed, when I put her on the kitchen scale half an hour later, 14 pounds and 2 ounces. That alone was the largest baby I had ever delivered, by nearly 4 pounds. But it was not the weight that I want to tell you about. It was not even the size of her hands, which were almost twice as long as a normal newborn's hands, and which closed around my finger with a grip that drew blood from my cuticle. It was not the dark, fine hair that covered her shoulders and her back and the outsides of her arms, hair I had seen before on small, premature babies, but never on a full-term infant, and never as thick as this. It was not the strange, deep, almost charcoal color of her skin underneath that hair, or the way her eyes, when she opened them in the lamplight, caught the flame and threw it back at me with a reflective sheen. It was her face. Her face was not the face of any newborn I had ever delivered. The brow was heavy. The bones of her cheeks were broad. The nose was wide and flat, with nostrils that flared when she breathed. Her mouth was very wide. Her chin was small but strong. When she looked at me, she did not look at me the way newborns look at the world, which is unfocused and unconcerned. She looked at me. She tracked my movements. She held my eyes for so long that I had to look away first, because the intelligence behind those infant eyes was not the intelligence of a baby a few minutes into the world. It was older than that. I remember the silence in that kitchen. Roland was still kneeling at the foot of the bed. Alma was holding Marie-Ange's hand. Marie-Ange had fallen back against the pillow with her eyes closed and tears running down her cheeks into her hair, breathing the slow, ragged breath of a woman who had survived something that had almost taken her. None of us spoke. The baby in my arms made a small sound that was not a cry. It was a hum, low, sustained, 3 notes that rose at the end. She did this for 4 or 5 seconds, and then she was quiet and she watched me. Roland spoke first. He said very softly, "Mon Dieu, Madame Tremblay, what is she?" I did not answer him. I cleaned the baby. I cut the cord. I wrapped her in the flannel I had warmed by the stove, and I carried her around to the head of the bed, and I laid her on Marie-Ange's chest. Marie-Ange opened her eyes. She looked down at her daughter. She did not look surprised. She did not look afraid. She lifted one shaking hand and stroked the dark hair on the baby's small back with the back of her index finger, and she said, "Bonjour, ma petite. Bonjour, ma belle." Then she looked up at me and at Alma and at Roland kneeling by the foot of the bed, and she said the only thing she ever said to all 3 of us at once on the subject of her daughter. She said, "Her father loved me. That is all I will ever say. Her father loved me, and he is alive, and he is in the forest, and if any of you ever speak of this child to anyone outside this room, I will take her into the trees, and you will never see either of us again." Alma was the first to speak. Alma, who had buried 2 husbands and 3 children, who had cooked for lumber crews for 27 years, who did not bend for any man, and very rarely for God. Alma reached out and put her hand on the dark hair of that baby's head, and she looked at Marie-Ange and she said, "Ma fille, nobody outside this room will ever know. I swear it on my mother's grave." Roland made the same promise. He said it in the formal French he had learned in school, the kind of French he never used otherwise because he understood that what he was saying needed the weight of formal language to hold it. Emile, who had come in by then and was standing in the doorway with the kettle still in his hand, said it without any words at all. He just nodded once and looked at me, and I knew what he meant. I made the promise too. I made it knowing I was a Catholic woman and a sage femme, and that the laws of the province of Quebec required me to register every birth I attended within 10 days. I made the promise because the alternative was to take that baby out of her mother's arms and put her into a system that would destroy them both, and I had not become a midwife in order to do that. We named her Aurore. Marie-Ange chose the name. It means dawn, and the baby had been born with the first gray light coming through the window, and Marie-Ange said the name out loud, and the baby in her arms hummed those 3 notes again, low and rising, as if she had heard her own name and approved. I registered the birth on the 18th of April, 1963, at the parish office in Saint-Méthode, which was the nearest civil registry to Rivière-aux-Cèdres. I wrote on the form that the mother was Marie-Ange Lavoie, and the father was Jean-Paul Lavoie, deceased, and that the baby was a girl named Aurore, born at home in the lumber settlement, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces. I wrote that weight knowing it was a lie. I wrote it because the truth would have brought a doctor to the camp within the week, and a doctor would have brought questions, and questions would have brought the kind of attention I had promised Marie-Ange would never reach her child. The clerk at Saint-Méthode was a woman named Béatrice Caron, who had been at school with my mother. She read the form. She looked at me over her glasses. She said, "Lucienne, are you certain about this weight?" I said yes. She wrote it down. She stamped the form. She has been dead for 26 years, and I never spoke to her about that birth again, and she never asked. That was the first lie. There would be many more. By the time Aurore was 3 months old, every man and woman in Rivière-aux-Cèdres knew. We had tried to keep it inside the kitchen of that small log house, but a settlement of 54 people cannot keep a secret from itself. The wives saw the baby first, the men saw her second, because the men came home in the evenings and the men talked to their wives. What I did not expect was the reaction. I had braced myself for fear, for revulsion, for the kind of small-town hysteria that drives families out of villages and into hiding. I had prepared in the privacy of my own kitchen for what I would do if Marie-Ange and Aurore had to leave Rivière-aux-Cèdres in the middle of the night. I had a list of cousins in northern New Brunswick who might take them in. I had a sum of money set aside that Emile and I had been saving for a vehicle. None of it was needed. What happened instead was that the men of Rivière-aux-Cèdres, those Saguenéens and Beaucerons and Acadians, those Catholic working men with calloused hands and small wages and limited educations, looked at the baby that Marie-Ange Lavoie had brought back from the forest, and they looked at the young widow herself, and they made a decision that none of them ever spoke about out loud, but that all of them honored for the rest of their lives. They decided that this child belonged to the camp, that whatever she was and whoever her father was, she had been born among them, and her mother was one of theirs, and she would be raised among them, and no one outside the perimeter of those 7 log houses and that bunkhouse and that smithy would ever know she existed. It was Roland Boudreau who organized it, though he would never have used the word organize. What Roland did was simpler. He went to each man in the camp one at a time, in the bunkhouse or in the smithy or out on the cutting line, and he said in his calm, low voice that Marie-Ange Lavoie had had her baby, and the baby was different, and the camp was going to take care of both of them, and any man who had a problem with that was free to speak up now, and any man who had a problem with it later was free to leave Rivière-aux-Cèdres at any time he wanted with no hard feelings. Then Roland would stand there with his hands at his sides and wait. Not one man spoke up. Not one man left. I have thought about that decision for 62 years, and I have come to believe that what made it possible was not bravery and not religion and not even the quiet authority of Roland Boudreau. What made it possible was the work itself. When you spend your life in the deep boreal forest, cutting trees that are older than your great-grandfathers, sleeping in the same bunkhouse with the same men through 6-month winters, you develop a different idea of what is normal. You see things in those forests that you do not talk about in towns. You hear things at night that you do not write home about. Aurore was not the first impossible thing those men had encountered in those woods. She was only the first one they had been asked to love. The men built up a code without ever sitting down to write it. When outsiders came to the camp, which happened perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, when the company sent a supervisor or a priest or a crown forester or a doctor to attend to one of the men, Marie-Ange and Aurore stayed inside the little log house. The curtains were drawn, and a different woman came out to the yard to fetch water from the pump and sweep the porch so that any visitor would see a woman doing ordinary things. This rotation was managed by Alma Gagnon and the foreman's wife, a woman named Cécile Bouchard. The children of the other families, of whom there were 9, were spoken to one at a time by their mothers and told that Aurore Lavoie was a special little girl who needed to be kept private from the rest of the world, and that loving her meant not telling anyone outside the camp that she existed. Children, in my experience, are far better at keeping serious secrets than adults give them credit for. Those 9 children grew up alongside Aurore, played with her, and not one of them in all the years before the camp closed ever spoke a word of her to a teacher or a relative or a school friend. Some are still alive. They are in their 70s now. They have grandchildren of their own, and they have never told. Aurore grew. That is the next thing I have to tell you, and it is not a simple telling, because the way she grew was not the way a human child grows. By 6 months she was walking, not toddling, not pulling up on furniture and dropping on her behind, walking. By her first birthday she could climb. The men built her a small fenced yard outside the log house so she would not climb the porch posts, which she could do as easily as I could climb a flight of stairs. By 2, she had teeth that were larger and stronger than the teeth of any 2-year-old I had ever examined. By 3, she could carry a stick of stove wood that her mother could not have lifted. By 5, she was as tall as Marie-Ange and still growing, and her shoulders had begun to broaden in a way that no 5-year-old girl's shoulders should broaden. But she was a child. That is what I want you to understand. She was a child in every way that mattered. She laughed at the same things any child would laugh at. She cried when her feelings were hurt. She loved her mother with the fierce, total love of a child who has only one parent, and she loved Alma Gagnon almost as much, because Alma fed her and scolded her and made her laugh, and she loved Roland Boudreau because Roland brought her wood scraps from the smithy that he had carved into small animals, and she loved my husband Emile because Emile read to her and never once asked her to read aloud back, because she could not in the way other children could, and Emile understood that and never made her feel it. She did not speak. That was the first thing that became clear to me. By the age of 2, when most children are forming their first sentences, Aurore was making sounds that were not French and not English and not any language I recognized. They were tonal, modulated, 3 notes most often low and rising, the same pattern she had made in the kitchen lamplight the night she was born. With her mother she had a fluency I could not understand, but that Marie-Ange clearly did. They would stand in the kitchen, and Aurore would hum a sequence of notes, and Marie-Ange would answer in French, and Aurore would respond with another sequence, and they would go back and forth like 2 women having a conversation about the weather. With the rest of us, Aurore used gestures and expressions, and she understood every word of French we spoke to her, but she did not produce French words herself. Marie-Ange told me in the autumn of 1965, when Aurore was 2.5, that she did not believe her daughter would ever speak French. She said this without sadness. She said her daughter spoke a language her father had taught her in the womb, and that language did not translate into the throat shapes that French required, and that asking Aurore to speak French was like asking a wren to bark. I asked her then if she would tell me about the father. She said no. She said she had told me at the moment of birth what she was going to tell me, and nothing had changed. But she did tell me one thing that autumn, which I have carried with me ever since. She told me that the father had not taken her against her will. She said this looking directly at me with her gray, startled eyes, very steady for once. She said he had found her in the forest on the 2nd day after she walked out of Rivière-aux-Cèdres. She had been sitting on a rock weeping for Jean-Paul, and she had looked up, and he had been there, standing at the edge of a stand of black spruce, watching her. He had been still and silent for so long that she had stopped being afraid. He had brought her food in slow, careful steps, set it on the rock beside her, and backed away. He had brought her water in a hollowed birch knot. He had built her a small shelter of pine boughs out of the wind. When she had finally let him sit beside her on the rock, after 7 days, he had wrapped his hair around her shoulders to keep her warm, and had hummed those 3 notes that her daughter would later make in the kitchen lamplight. She said she had loved him. She said it in the simple, direct way a woman speaks of something true. She had loved Jean-Paul, and she had loved this one in a different way, and the second love had not erased the first, and she did not expect anyone in this world to understand both loves in the same heart, but they had both been real, and they had both been hers. The only reason she had come back to Rivière-aux-Cèdres was that she had known by the 4th week she was carrying a child, and she had known he could not raise a child in the forest in winter, and she had known the camp could. I asked her if she still saw him. She did not answer with words. She got up and walked to the kitchen window and pulled the curtain aside, and she pointed across the cleared yard, past the smithy, past the stable, to the dark wall of the spruce forest beyond, and she said, "He is there now. He has been there every day since I came back. He has never come closer than the tree line, but he is there." I looked. I will tell you honestly that I did not see anything. I saw the tree line. I saw the spruces black against the late afternoon light. I saw a small wind moving through the upper branches, but I felt something. The way you feel a person looking at you across a crowded church, I felt the weight of attention from somewhere in those trees, attention that was specific to me, that knew me, that was looking at the woman in the kitchen window beside Marie-Ange and was registering her as a known and accepted face. I felt it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then it lifted, the way a hand lifts off a shoulder, and I was just looking at the trees. I drew the curtain close. Marie-Ange smiled at me. She said, "Now you know." I went home and I sat in my own kitchen for a long time, and Emile came in and looked at my face and made me a cup of tea and did not ask me anything. That night I did not sleep until almost dawn, and what I lay awake thinking was not what you might expect. I was not lying awake, afraid. I was lying awake reconsidering every story my mother had told me and her mother had told her about the things that lived in the forests of the Saguenay. I was lying awake thinking about the old word the Innu people who fished in the Parabanca had for the tall ones who walked in the deep woods. I had spent my whole life as a sage femme drawing children out of women into the world, and I had always believed I knew exactly how many kinds of children there were. And I had been wrong about that, and being wrong did not feel like the catastrophe I would have expected. It felt like the world had been larger than I knew all along, and I had only just been let into the larger room. That winter, the winter of 1965 into 1966, was the coldest I had ever lived through. The temperature dropped to 38 below for 9 consecutive nights in January, and the kitchen building's water pipe burst, and 2 of the men got frostbite serious enough to lose toes. The road to Roberval was closed for 3 weeks. We were sealed in. It was during that winter that I saw him for the first time. I had walked over to Marie-Ange's house at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in early February carrying a tin of cookies Alma had baked. The light was already failing. The wind had died down the way it does just before a serious cold sets in, and the air was so still I could hear my own boots squeaking on the snow from 100 feet away. Marie-Ange let me in, and Aurore, who was almost 3, ran to me and wrapped her arms around my legs and made the 3-note hum that meant hello. We talked about ordinary things, whether the road would open in time for a delivery of medical supplies, whether Cécile Bouchard's youngest boy was going to need his tonsils out, whether Aurore was outgrowing the wool coat I had made for her in October, which she clearly was. Then Aurore lifted her head. She looked at the door. She made a sound I had not heard her make before. It was a single low note, sustained, with no rise at the end. Marie-Ange went very still. A second sound came from outside, from the direction of the tree line, perhaps 80 meters from the back of the house. The same single low note held the same length, answering. It was deeper than Aurore's note. It carried through the wood of the walls, and I felt it in the floor under my feet before I heard it in my ears. Marie-Ange got up. She walked to the back window of the kitchen. She stood there for a long moment, looking out, and then she turned to me, and her face was very calm, and she said, "He has come closer. He is at the edge of the yard. He has never come this close before." I stood up. I walked to the window. Aurore came with me, holding my hand. Outside in the failing light, with the snow on the ground reflecting back the last gray of the sky, I saw him for the first time. He was standing at the corner of the smithy, perhaps 40 meters from the house. He was very tall. I would learn later by measuring his footprints that he was just over 7.5 feet. But in that first moment, I did not measure him in feet. I measured him against the smithy doorway, which was 8 feet high, and his head reached the upper third of it. His shoulders were broader than the doorway was wide. He was covered in dark hair, almost black with gray along the chest and the sides of the face, hair that was long and straight and hung past his shoulders. His face was the face I had seen the night Aurore was born, scaled up to adulthood, the same broad cheeks, the same heavy brow, the same wide flat nose, the same wide mouth, and the same eyes deep set under the brow, catching the last light and throwing it back at me with that reflective sheen that I had seen in his daughter's eyes. He was looking at me, not at Marie-Ange, not at Aurore, at me. He had come into the yard in failing light on the coldest evening of the coldest winter in memory to look at the woman who had pulled his daughter out of his wife. He raised one hand. It was the size of a snow shovel. He held it palm out level with his shoulder, and he kept it there for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 4 or 5 seconds. Then he made the sound, the single low note deep that I had felt through the floor. He held it for perhaps 4 seconds, and then he lowered his hand and he stepped backward into the shadow of the smithy, and he was gone. I have thought about that gesture for 60 years. I have come to understand it in a way I could not understand it then. It was a thank you. It was the only kind of thank you he had to give. I did not cry until I got back to my own house, and then I cried for an hour. Emile sat beside me and did not ask me what had happened because he could see what had happened written all over my face, and he understood that some things need to be wept out before they can be spoken. When I had finished crying, I told him everything. He listened, he nodded. He said only one thing. He said, "Lucienne, the world is more full than we knew. Try to sleep." I tried. I did not sleep that night either. By the spring of 1966, Aurore was going into the forest with her mother. They did not go far. They went only as far as the first stand of large spruces beyond the smithy, where there was a clearing with a flat rock, and they would go in the late afternoon when the men were still on the cutting line, and they would come back before supper. I asked Marie-Ange once if I could come with them, and she said no, not yet, and I did not ask again. She told me that summer that Aurore was meeting her father. She did not say it as a great revelation. She said it as another mother might say her child was visiting her grandparents. She said the visits were short and gentle, and that Aurora was learning things from him that she could not learn from anyone in the camp. She said he was teaching her his language, the tonal language that I had heard him use in the snow that February evening, and that Aurora was, for the first time in her life, speaking fluently with another being who could speak back. Then, on the 16th of August, 1966, Marie-Ange came to my door at first light, and she was holding Aurore on her hip, and her face was the color of the kitchen wall, and she said, "Lucienne, he is not at the rock this morning. He has not come to the rock for 3 days. Something has happened to him." Roland Boudreau and 3 of the younger men went into the forest that morning. They did not tell the rest of the camp what they were looking for. They told the foreman they were checking for blowdown on the eastern boundary, and they took a rifle and a coil of rope and a canvas tarpaulin, and they did not come back until almost dark. What they found they told only to me and to Marie-Ange. They found the father about 4 kilometers into the forest at the foot of a steep talus slope above a small stream that fed into the Parabanca. He had fallen or been pushed by something, and one of his legs was broken below the knee, and he had dragged himself perhaps 200 meters down to the stream before he had been unable to drag himself any further. He was alive. He was very weak. He had been there, by Roland's estimate, for 4 or 5 days. He had drunk from the stream, and he had eaten some moss and the inner bark of a young birch he had been able to reach, but he had not been able to hunt or to walk out, and he had been waiting the way a hurt animal waits for either the strength to get up or the kind of cold that takes the decision away. Roland sat down on a rock at a distance the father could see, and he set down the rifle, and he held up both his empty hands, and he sat there for a long time, not speaking, until the father's eyes had stopped following his every movement and had begun instead to look past him the way a hurt thing looks past whatever is in front of it when it has decided that whatever happens next will happen. Then Roland said in French, "Marie-Ange sent us. We are her people. We are going to take you home." He did not expect to be understood. The words were for himself, he told me later, more than for the one on the ground. They were the words a man says when he is about to do a thing that he cannot do silently. The father lifted his head. He looked at Roland. He held the look for what Roland said felt like a full minute. Then he made a sound, low and short, 2 notes, and he lay back against the rocks and he closed his eyes, and Roland understood that he had been given permission. The 4 of them carried him out on the canvas tarpaulin. He weighed, by Roland's guess, somewhere over 400 pounds, and the carry took 11 hours, and they had to stop every few hundred meters because 4 men cannot carry 400 pounds through old-growth boreal forest at speed without breaking themselves doing it. They reached the back of Marie-Ange's log house at 3 in the morning. They did not bring him inside. He was too large to fit through the door. They laid him in the lee of the house on the south side, where the woodshed sheltered him from the wind, and they covered him with 3 wool blankets and one of Marie-Ange's quilts, and they built a small fire in a ring of stones, and they sat with him until light. I came at first light with my bag. I had set Aurore's broken arm 2 summers earlier when she had fallen from the porch railing, and I had treated infections and stitched cuts on every man and woman in the camp at one time or another, but I had never set the leg of a being who weighed 400 pounds and had bones the thickness of my forearm. I told Roland I did not know if I could do it. Roland said neither did he, but the alternative was worse. We did it together. Marie-Ange held one end of his leg. Roland held the other. Two of the younger men leaned on his shoulders to keep him still. I aligned the bones by feel, the way I had been taught to align human bones by feel, and the father did not cry out, though I felt his whole body shake with what the pain was costing him. We splinted the leg with two cedar staves Emile had cut and shaped while we worked. We bound the splint with strips of an old bedsheet. We fed him broth out of a bowl the size of a small bucket. He took it, he swallowed. He looked at Marie-Ange, and he made the three-note hum that his daughter had been making since the night she was born. And Marie-Ange answered him in the same notes, and they had a conversation that lasted perhaps 10 minutes, of which I understood not a single sound and every single thing that was meant. He stayed in the lee of that woodshed for 6 weeks. Aurore was with him most of every day. Marie-Ange brought him food. Emile and Roland built a small lean-to over him to keep the rain off. The other men of the camp came, one or two at a time, on quiet evenings, and they sat at a respectful distance, and they nodded to him, and he nodded back, and not one of them spoke a word about it to anyone outside the camp. He healed. The leg was never quite right again, and afterward, when he moved through the forest, you could hear the small unevenness in his step if you knew what to listen for, but he could walk, and he could climb, and he could hunt, and on the 1st of October, 1966, he stood up in the lee of that woodshed, and he lifted Aurore onto his shoulder, and he held Marie-Ange's hand in his, and the three of them walked into the forest together, and none of them came out for 9 days. When Marie-Ange came back, alone on the 10th day, she came to my house first. She sat at my kitchen table and she drank a cup of tea, and she told me that Aurore was going to spend half her time in the forest from now on and half her time in the camp. She said the father had a family, his own kind, who lived in the high country above the Peribanca, and he wanted his daughter to know them. She said Aurora wanted that too. She said she had agreed because she trusted him and because she had known from the moment she had walked back into the camp pregnant that her daughter was going to belong to two worlds, and the only question was how to give her both. I asked her if she was going to go with Aurore. She said sometimes, not always. She said she had her own life in the camp and her own friends and her own work, which by then was helping Alma in the kitchen and helping me with prenatal visits when one of the wives was expecting. She said the forest was Aurora's other home, and her own home was here, and the in-between of those two places was the hardest thing she had ever lived inside, but she could live inside it because the alternative was losing one or the other, and she was not willing to lose either. That was how it went for the next 12 years. Aurore would be in the camp for 2 weeks and in the forest for 2 weeks, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. She came home larger every time. By the age of 10, she was as tall as Roland, and by 12, she was taller, and by 15, she was the largest being that ever walked into our kitchen, ducking the doorway by reflex, sitting at the table with her knees rising above the level of the boards. She was beautiful. I want to say that because I think it has not been said. She was beautiful in a way that did not fit into any of the categories the world had given me for beauty. Her face was the face of her father, broad and strong, and her eyes were the gray of her mother's. She moved like something that had been told the rules of human movement once and had decided to follow most of them. She laughed silently with her shoulders as her father laughed. She cried out loud as her mother cried. She loved me. I want to say that too. She loved me as a girl loves the woman who pulled her into the world. She would come into my kitchen after a time in the forest, and she would put her enormous hand on my shoulder and lean her head against the top of my head, and she would hum the 3 notes that meant hello, and I would put my hand over hers, and we would stand like that for as long as she needed, which was sometimes a minute and sometimes longer. The camp closed in 1978. The company had been losing money on the Peribanca operation for 3 years. The easy timber was gone, and they shut us down on the 1st of August. Roland Boudreau bought a small farm near Saint-Ambroise. Emile and I bought a small house in Dolbeau, where I went on practicing as a sage femme until the province formalized midwifery in the 1990s, and I quietly let my unofficial practice end. Marie-Ange did not come with us. She did not come south at all. On the day the trucks came to haul the bunkhouse out, she stood in the yard of her little log house with a rucksack over her shoulder and Aurore at her side, and she hugged me, and she hugged Emile, and she hugged Alma, and she hugged Roland, and she said, "I am going home." She walked into the forest. Aurore walked beside her. They did not look back. I did not see Marie-Ange Lavoie again for 16 years. The men kept the secret without her. That is one of the things I want you to understand. After the camp closed, when the small fellowship of 54 people scattered into towns and farms across the Saguenay and the Lac Saint-Jean, not one of them broke. Not in beer halls, not in confessionals, not on deathbeds. The promise that had been made in Marie-Ange's kitchen on the 8th of April, 1963, was honored by every man who had been in that camp until the last of them, Roland Boudreau, died in his sleep on the 2nd of February of this year. I have wondered sometimes what made that possible in a world where secrets do not usually keep. I have come to believe it was not the secret itself. It was that the secret had a face. Each of those men had held Aurore as a baby or watched her run in the fenced yard or accepted a piece of carved wood from her small hands. The secret was not a creed they had been told to defend. It was a child they had been told to protect. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. In the autumn of 1979, I was 52 years old, and Emile and I were living in our small house in Dolbeau. And on the 11th of October, in the late afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I opened it. A young woman was standing on my porch. She was perhaps 16 years old, and she was very tall, 6 feet at least, with dark hair and gray eyes, and a face that was not quite the face I remembered, but was close enough that my hands started to shake before my mind had caught up. She said, in French that was clear, but had an unfamiliar music to it, "Madame Tremblay, my mother sent me. She said you would know me." It was Aurore. She was 16 years old. She had been raised mostly in the forest, and she had learned French from her mother and had practiced it with the few people from the camp she had stayed in contact with, but she had never lived in a town, and the world she walked into when she walked into Dolbeau that day was as new to her as the surface of the moon. I brought her inside. I made her tea. She sat at my kitchen table in a chair that was almost, but not quite too small for her, and she told me in halting, careful French that her mother was alive and well and was living with the father's family in the high country above the Peribanca, and that the family had grown to include 11 of the father's kind across 2 generations, and that Aurore had a half-brother and a half-sister born to her father by another female of his kind. She did not come back to me pregnant, not yet. She came back to begin learning the human world. She stayed with me in Dolbeau for the next year, sleeping in Emile's reading room, learning to read and write French at a level beyond what her mother had been able to teach her, learning how to ride in a car and how to use the telephone and how to sit in a cafe without drawing attention to her size. It was in the summer of 1980 that she met him, a French-Canadian biologist named Olivier Fortin, who had been doing solo wildlife survey work in the Upper Peribanca and who had stumbled into a clearing where Aurore had been alone on a visit back to her father's family, and who had not run and who had not screamed, and who had sat down on a rock the way Roland had sat down on a rock 14 years earlier and held up his hands and waited. Aurore spent the rest of that summer learning what kind of man he was. She decided by the end of August that he was the kind of man her mother had told her existed, but whom she had never expected to meet. She let him touch her hand. She let him sit beside her. She agreed to meet him in the same clearing the next summer and the next, and on the 3rd summer, she let him stay through the autumn, and by the time he had to leave to take a position at the Université Laval, she was carrying his child. She was 20 years old, and the child was due in the early winter, and she had decided, after long conversations with her mother and with her father and with the matriarch of the father's family, that this child should be born in the human world with a human midwife in a warm house with a doctor on call if anything went wrong, because this child would have to live, at least partly, in the world her father came from. And a child who would have to live in a world should be born into that world. I asked her where she was going to give birth. She said she had hoped I would help her decide. I helped her. I took her the next morning to the obstetrics clinic at the regional hospital in Roberval, where I had a friend named Dr. Hélène Caron, no relation to the Béatrice Caron who had stamped Aurore's birth certificate 20 years earlier, and Hélène examined Aurore and asked careful questions and ordered the kinds of tests one orders for an expectant mother, and she found, as I had known she would, that the pregnancy was unusual. Aurore's measurements were unusual. Her hemoglobin was unusually high. Her bone density readings were higher than the machine had been calibrated to expect. Helene asked me privately in her office whether there was something I had not told her. I told her there was, and that I would tell her one day, but not yet. Helene, who was 48, and had been delivering babies in the Saguenay for 20 years, looked at me over her glasses and said, "Lucienne, I have known you for 25 years. If you are asking me to help you, I am helping you. I will not ask again." She did not. She kept Aurore's records private. She delivered the baby herself with me assisting on the 4th of December, 1983, in a private room at the regional hospital that Hélène had arranged for. The baby was a girl, Marie-Ange's granddaughter, Olivier's daughter, my second-generation responsibility. She weighed 9 pounds and 11 ounces, which was large, but not impossibly so, and she had her mother's gray eyes and her grandmother's small chin and her grandfather's broad cheekbones in a face that was the most beautiful blend of two lineages I have ever held. Aurore named her Hélène, after the doctor who had delivered her. The doctor cried, I cried. Olivier, who had driven up from Quebec City the moment Aurore had gone into labor, sat in the corner of the room in the same kind of dazed, grateful silence I have seen on the face of every father who has been allowed into the room where his child was born. Aurore stayed in Dolbeau with me for 2 months after the birth. Olivier stayed with us, sleeping on the small couch in my parlor, learning to change a diaper, learning to wake at 2 in the morning to a hungry baby. And then in February, when little Hélène was strong enough to travel, Aurore and Olivier and the baby went south to Quebec City, where Olivier had a small apartment near the university, and they began the long and difficult work of building a life that could hold all of what Hélène was. It was not easy. Hélène grew faster than other children, though not as fast as her mother had. She was tall by 3. She had her mother's hair on her arms and back, finer than her mother's but visible, and Aurore taught her, from the time she could understand, that she would have to keep her sleeves long and her hair loose, and that some things about her body were for her family and not for the world. Hélène understood. She was a calm, observant child, and she had her mother's quietness and her father's patience. Olivier was a good husband to Aurore. He stayed her husband for the rest of his life, which was not as long as it should have been. He died of a heart attack in 1998 at the age of 54. Aurore brought his ashes back to the Upper Peribanca and buried them at the foot of a particular spruce that he had been fond of, and she stayed in the forest for almost a year afterward, grieving him among her father's people. Hélène, who was 14 by then, stayed with me in Dolbeau through that year, and she finished her freshman year of high school in the local school. And she and I became, in those months, something closer than great aunt and great niece. We became something I do not have a word for, except to say that she trusted me with her body and her body's strangeness, and I trusted her with the secret I had carried for 35 years, and the trust ran in both directions and made us, for that year, family of a kind older than the kind that runs through blood. Hélène grew up. She went to university. She studied biology like her father, and she met a young man in her 3rd year whose name was Mathieu Desjardins, and she fell in love with him, and she told him on the night before he proposed to her what she was. Mathieu was 23 years old, a graduate student, a native of Chicoutimi, and the great-grandson of a man who had spent his working life in the lumber camps of the Saguenay. He listened to Hélène for 2 hours, and then he said, "Hélène, I want to marry you. None of what you have told me changes that. Some of what you have told me makes me love you more, because it explains things about you I had loved without understanding." They were married in the autumn of 2003. Aurore came down out of the forest for the wedding. Marie-Ange came down too. Marie-Ange was 59 years old by then, and she had lived for 25 years among her husband's people, and she walked into the church in Chicoutimi on Aurore's arm in a dress Alma Gagnon had sewn for her in 1965, and she sat in the front pew and watched her granddaughter marry a good man. I was 76 years old at that wedding. I did not expect to attend any more deliveries in this life. I had been retired for 12 years and my hands were not as steady as they had been. But Hélène took me aside at the reception and she put her hand on mine and she said, "Lucienne, when my baby comes, I want you in the room. I do not want anyone else." She was not pregnant yet. She was telling me what she would want when the time came. I told her I would be there. The time came in the autumn of 2004. Hélène was 21 weeks along when she came up to Dolbeau to spend the last months of the pregnancy with me. Mathieu came too because his graduate work could be done anywhere there was a reliable internet connection and a quiet room, and he set up his laptop in my parlor and he wrote his dissertation while his wife grew their daughter in the bedroom that had been Émile's reading room. Aurore came down for the birth. So did Marie-Ange. They came down together, walking out of the forest north of Saint-Ambroise on the 15th of October, and Roland Boudreau, who was 68 years old by then and still keeping the secret, drove them up to Dolbeau in his pickup truck. The birth was on the 3rd of November, 2004. Hélène labored for 12 hours. The baby was big, but not as big as her mother had been or as her grandmother had been. She came out into my hands at 4:11 in the morning, which was the same hour Aurore had been born, and Marie-Ange, who was sitting in the corner of the bedroom with her hands folded in her lap, looked up at the clock on the wall and made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, because she remembered the hour, and so did I. The baby weighed 8 pounds and 1 ounce. She was the smallest of the lineage. Her hair was not visible on her arms or her back unless you looked very closely. Her face was the face of the camp. In some way I cannot explain, even though she had never been to Rivière-aux-Cèdres and never would, because Rivière-aux-Cèdres no longer existed. The buildings had been hauled out 26 years earlier, and the road had grown over, and the rivers had moved their banks, and the place I had lived in for 17 years was already a memory inside other memories. But her face was the face of that camp, and when I laid her on Hélène's chest, Marie-Ange got up from her chair and walked to the bedside, and she said, "Hello, ma toute petite, hello, from your great-grandmother." Hélène named her Aurore, after her mother, after the name Marie-Ange had whispered in a kitchen on the 8th of April, 1963, while a baby in her arms hummed 3 notes that nobody in the room had ever heard before. That was the 3rd generation. That was the birth I attended in 2004, the one whose mother is now 21 years old and asking me whether her grandmother's story will be remembered. I want to tell you what has happened in the years since. Marie-Ange Lavoie died in the forest in the spring of 2010. She was 66 years old. Her husband had died the winter before of injuries from a fall that did not heal as they should have, and Marie-Ange did not last long without him. She was buried by his family in their own manner in a place I have never seen and never will see. And Aurore came down out of the forest a month later and told me, sitting at my kitchen table, that her mother had asked at the end to be remembered as a girl who had walked out of a logging camp into a forest and had been given by the forest a life she had not expected and would not have traded. Aurore is 62 years old now. She lives in the Upper Peribonka most of the year, and she comes down to Dolbeau in the summers to visit me, and she stays in the small spare bedroom that used to be Émile's reading room, and she sleeps on a custom-made bed that Roland Boudreau built for her in 1983 when she came back from the forest pregnant. She reads, She gardens with me when she is here. She is the closest thing to a daughter I have ever had. Hélène is 42 years old, a biologist at the Université Laval, married to Mathieu Still, and the mother of 3 children, of whom little Aurore was the first. The other 2 are boys born in 2007 and 2010, and they live in the human world without difficulty, and they know what they are and where they come from, and they keep the secret, and the secret has now passed to a 4th generation that will keep it after I am gone. Little Aurore, who is not little anymore, is 21 years old. She studies anthropology at McGill. She has her great-grandmother's gray eyes and her grandfather's broad cheekbones and a quiet, observant intelligence that reminds me every time I see her of the baby I held in a kitchen 62 years ago. She came to see me last month. She sat at my kitchen table in the same chair her great-grandmother had sat in. She held my hand. She said, "Tante Lucienne, I have been thinking about my grandmother's story. I do not think it should die with you and me. I do not think we have the right to let it die." I asked her what she wanted me to do. She said, "I want you to tell it. I want you to put it on a recording. I want my children to hear your voice telling it, and their children, and on until the world is ready to hear what was in those forests and what loved my great-grandmother and what loves us still." I told her I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I thought about Marie-Ange, who had walked into a forest at 19 and walked out 41 days later, carrying a child she would never apologize for. I thought about Aurore, who had spent her childhood between 2 worlds and had built out of that strange division a life of her own. I thought about Hélène and her 3 children. I thought about the men of Rivière-aux-Cèdres, every one of them now in the ground, who had decided in the spring of 1963 to protect a child they did not understand. I thought about Roland Boudreau, who had sat down on a rock in the forest and held up his empty hands and trusted the one in front of him to know what those hands meant. I thought most of all about what Emile had said on the night I told him about the first time I had seen the father in our yard. He had said, "Lucienne, the world is more full than we knew." That is the sentence I want to leave you with. Not as a warning, not as a revelation, as a small, quiet truth that an old country sage femme has spent 62 years trying to hold steady in her hands. The world is more full than we knew. There are kinds of love it does not have names for, and kinds of family it does not have categories for, and kinds of intelligence and tenderness and faithfulness that walk through the forests of the Saguenay and have walked there for longer than any of us have walked anywhere. They have not asked to be found. They have not asked to be studied. They have asked only to be left alone, and once or twice in a long while, when one of them falls in love with one of us, they have asked to be allowed to keep their families together. The men of Rivière-aux-Cèdres said yes. I said yes. My husband said yes. My friend Roland, who carried a wounded father out of the forest on a canvas tarpaulin in the autumn of 1966, said yes. We said yes for 62 years, and we kept saying yes, and not one of us in all those years has regretted it. If you have heard this story to the end, I am going to ask you for one thing. I'm going to ask you to say yes to, not to put us in books, not to put us on television, not to send researchers into the upper Peribanca, just to know in the back of your heart that what I have told you is true, and to leave my granddaughters and their children and their children's children to live the lives they have been given in 2 worlds that have been making room for each other very quietly for 62 years now. That is what Marie-Ange asked me in a kitchen on the morning her daughter was born. That is what Aurore asks of me now, every time she comes down out of the forest and sits at my table and lets me brush her hair. That is what little Aurore is asking when she tells me she does not want her grandmother's story to die with us. The story does not have to die. It only has to be carried the way a sleeping child is carried, with care, with steadiness, and with a willingness to keep walking through the dark until the next pair of arms is ready. I am ready to put this child down now. I have carried her a long way. I am 88 years old and my hands are tired, but they are still warm. and I lay them one last time on the soft head of this story, and I bless it, and I leave it in your keeping. Be gentle with her. She has been loved by good people for a long time.